Before we start today's story, I just wanted to take a second to say thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel, both old and new. It means a lot to know that you guys understand the importance of bringing these stories to light. And trust me, I understand exactly how heavy these details can be, so I appreciate you being here. I find myself saying that a lot recently, but I always want to make sure I show you guys my appreciation. And I also want to make sure I give you guys a fair warning before the video starts. Today's story contains details involving a 20-month-old child that are going to be extremely upsetting for anyone who's tuning in. So before going into the video, please keep that in mind. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
The hit-and-run driver that killed a 5-year-old boy in Queens earlier this month. Police say Xavier Charchapula fled the scene after fatally striking Jonathan Isaac Martinez on September 1st. Martinez and his parents were crossing the street at 100th and McIntosh Streets in East Elmhurst at the time of the incident. His parents walked away physically unharmed. Police say that Charchapula is unlicensed and his truck was neither inspected nor insured.
A Bronx mother is in custody charged with child endangerment after her 6-year-old daughter was found dead in their apartment.
2 days after the little girl was found dead in her 12th floor apartment, police say with marks on her body and wrists. Her mother, 26-year-old Linnea Eason, is now charged with child endangerment.
Now to some frightening video from right here in New York City. It shows a man trying to abduct a child, but fortunately he didn't get far. Watch as a grandmother of 3 small children walk into frame to the left of your screen. A man covered in a blanket approaches, suddenly swoops down, yanks the young girl from her grandmother's grasp and runs. Frantically, the grandmother chases him.
Whether you're on YouTube, watching the evening news, or reading the paper, you've likely seen countless reports where the victims in the stories are children. You've seen kids become victims of random attacks, hit and runs, assaults by their so-called loved ones, and kidnappings in broad daylight. It's safe to say that children aren't always safe, and anything can happen at any time, not just in New York City, but anywhere. In the winter of 1998, some residents in Brooklyn, New York found themselves in the middle of one of those exact situations, when a baby, not even 2 years old, was snatched right out of her mother's arms. But what started out as an investigation into a brazen kidnapping would soon turn into something much, much darker. And the answers that authorities were seeking were much closer than they could have ever imagined. On today's episode of Evil Intentions, this is Gravesend, the story of baby Victoria.
The man snatched her baby while she was boarding a Manhattan-bound F train.
Oh, another tragic story involving violence against a child tonight. This one in Brooklyn.
Victoria Maria Santiago was born in 1997 and resided in Brooklyn, New York. She was born to a woman named Maria Victoria Santiago. While Brooklyn is where the mother and daughter would find themselves, it isn't where today's story begins. Santiago hailed all the way from San Antonio, Texas, a location with a little over 1 million people back in 1998, versus Brooklyn, which had a little over 2.7 million people residing there at the time. If you're comparing San Antonio and Brooklyn, they're completely different. Many who've made the transition from one to the other have expressed how difficult it can be to get used to. In the early 90s, this was where Santiago called home. While living here, she would meet a man named Mauro, who she'd end up in a relationship with. It's unclear how long they were together, but their relationship was pretty serious, with the two of them eventually deciding to become married. Even though marriage was a huge commitment for the two, as it is for anyone, it seemed that they were okay with going down that road, and before they knew it, they were expecting a child together. By spring of 1997, the couple were welcoming a healthy baby girl into the world, a blessing for a couple who's on the same page. She would be named Victoria, given her mother's middle name. Unfortunately, not every relationship has the same results, and some reach their end sooner than others, resulting in parents going their separate ways. That's what happened with Maria and Mauro. No official reasons as to why the two would separate, but it would result in Maria leaving San Antonio altogether and making her way to none other than New York City when baby Victoria was just 17 months old. By September of 1998, Santiago and her baby were residents of Brooklyn, New York, living in the Bay Ridge area specifically. In the 90s, the area was experiencing a shift in demographic, as were other parts of the borough. The area once had a large Scandinavian population, as well as Italian and Irish, an area with many families who've been there for generations. A melting pot of different cultures can be found here today. From Narrow's Botanical Gardens to Owl's Head Park, to the many shopping and dining options, the neighborhood has it all. And this was a whole different experience for Santiago, coming all the way from Texas. It would be quite an adjustment, especially with a child to care for. But while it was a huge change, she wasn't alone in it. After separating and making the move, Santiago was now in a new relationship with a man named Jorge Rivera, 19 years old. After just a few months, the couple would move in together, residing at 315 93rd Street in Brooklyn, back then known as the Spofford Hotel. The location was used as a rooming house or a single-room occupancy dwelling. This meant that most of the rooms here would be rented out individually, with those who reside there sharing main spaces like the bathrooms and the kitchen. It was Santiago, Rivera, and baby Victoria, and while here, the couple paid rent by the day. Most times, this type of living arrangement isn't meant to be long-term, but the most important thing was that they had a roof over their heads, especially since they had a baby in their care. For months, things seemed to be going perfectly normal, and living in Brooklyn, New York was working out just fine. But on the morning of December 4th of 1998, Maria Santiago would find herself seeking the help of strangers and authorities, and baby Victoria was at the center of it all. That morning, at around 8 a.m., Santiago left the Spofford Hotel, taking a 5-minute walk to the Bay Ridge 95th Street station, where she boarded a train and made her way to Smith and 9th Street in Gowanus, Brooklyn. She was walking underground, making her way from the train she took up to the elevated F train above. She had traveled on the trains in the past, and on this morning, had baby Victoria with her. Like most of the stations out here during the morning commute, the trains and platforms were very crowded, the norm. But in a matter of seconds, it would all take a sudden and surprising turn, not only for her, but for the people taking the same route. As she walked underground, out of nowhere came a man who would snatch Victoria right from her arms, and he quickly ran away, boarding a Manhattan-bound F train. It all happened so fast, almost in the blink of an eye. Left with nothing else to do, she exited the Smith and 9th Street station, seeking help. At around 8:50 a.m., as people came and went into the station, Santiago stood at the corner, telling people that her child had been kidnapped and she needed help finding her. Many would just keep walking. Others stopped and did their best to calm her down. Not that she was frantic or anything, but obviously she had to have been worried and counting the seconds until she'd be reunited with her baby. Passerbys believed that she was just in shock and did what they could to help her. They contacted authorities for her, letting them know that a woman was in distress and her child had been abducted by a stranger. Minutes later, police would arrive, able to speak to Santiago in person. She asked that they find her baby as quickly as possible and gave a description of the child they would be looking for. She would say that Victoria was wearing a pink dress and white shoes with her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was also able to give a description of the man who took her. He was described as a heavy-set, bulky Hispanic male, standing at about 5'6" and 200 pounds, wearing a flannel shirt and black pants. They asked for anything else she might have seen that could help them locate her daughter. She would say that all she knew was that the man quickly took her daughter from her arms and ran. She tried to chase after him, but it was far too crowded. He then jumped on a Manhattan-bound train and that's the last time she saw him or her daughter. They didn't have much to go on, but they tried to work with what they had. The ordeal would cause a manhunt between Brooklyn and Manhattan, resulting in delays during the morning commute that would last close to an hour. Authorities would canvass the area and made the call to stop trains at the stations ahead. Those trains that were stopped ahead were also searched, but they couldn't find the man that took Victoria. They couldn't find a man who fit the description that was given, or a little girl in the clothing Victoria was said to be wearing. They also couldn't find anyone who had actually witnessed the kidnapping, even if it was a crowded station where many would likely see. It wasn't an easy task attempting the search, and time wasn't on their side. For the next few hours, from around 9 a.m. to noon, the search continued. But the more they asked Santiago questions, the more her story started to change. She gave them different descriptions and different accounts of what had taken place. Both Santiago and later on, her boyfriend, Jorge Rivera, were taken to the 68th precinct for further questioning. While here, detectives had an idea. The Smith and 9th Street station had cameras that were fully operational when all this took place. So this meant that they could look through the various recordings that would be available to them to try and build an accurate timeline and hopefully get a look at who took the child. In situations like these, details are often confused, and a parent in distress can remember things differently from how they took place. So they wanted a verification. Now you also have to remember that this was at a time when surveillance wasn't what it is today. Many of the stations were not equipped with cameras, and those that were often had cameras that didn't work and needed maintenance. Detectives mentioning cameras changed everything, and it was something that Santiago was not expecting. Authorities applied more pressure with their questions because with the inconsistencies, they were starting to grow more and more suspicious. This would lead to Santiago giving authorities a new version of her story, one very different from the one that she had been telling for hours. They were here investigating a kidnapping, and the last thing that they expected was a grisly confession. Once she was told about the cameras, Santiago would go on to tell authorities that Victoria wasn't taken at all. If they really wanted to find her, they would need to go to the bay, Gravesend Bay, just a short ride away from Coney Island. Thrown off and very surprised by this admission, they asked her what she meant exactly. Where was she? And how did she end up here? What was her role in this? More importantly, was the child alive, since it was now clear that she had been lying and covering things up? Her answers to those questions detailed nothing but horror for baby Victoria. She stated that she wasn't exactly sure where her baby was by this point, but she knew where she left her, offshore Parkway near Bay 44th Street, in the water. She described the location as being near a broken down building, which in actuality turned out to be an active construction site. One of the detectives questioning her knew exactly what she was referring to, since he was very familiar with that area. The info she provided and knowledge of the location would lead authorities to now canvassing Gravesend Bay and the Coney Island Creek. It would be around 12:30 p.m., just a few hours after Santiago made claims of a kidnapping, that they searched that area. And after a few minutes, they would set eyes on a black bag that was in the water. As they looked closer, they noticed a small pair of feet popping out of a hole in the bag. It was baby Victoria's small body lying inside, partially submerged in the shallow water. She was clad in only a diaper. This is when they noticed that she had obvious injuries to the left side of her face and her head, but they weren't sure how she got them. Her body was located where the Coney Island Creek and Gravesend Bay meet. A stroller was also found floating nearby. A kidnapping investigation had turned into something far worse in just a matter of hours, and after getting more answers out of Santiago and Rivera, authorities will learn that while they were searching for some make-believe kidnapper, this baby was already gone for almost 2 days. Rivera would tell authorities everything he knew, and soon after, Santiago was making more shocking admissions. It all began on Wednesday, December 2nd of 1998, at around 9 p.m., less than 2 days before Santiago crafted this elaborate hoax. She stated that while in her room at the Spofford Hotel, she was with baby Victoria, and she wouldn't stop crying. She said the baby was, quote, always complaining. In order to make her baby quiet, she would start smacking her, only causing her to cry even more. She then began shaking her, which obviously didn't help either. Her cries only became louder. After abusing the child and inflicting this pain upon her, she became filled with rage at the child's nonstop crying. She would take her small body and throw her across the room, with the baby's head slamming into the headboard of the bed, causing her to bleed from the mouth and her skull to break open. She slapped her some more, and after this, Santiago would begin to rip a bedsheet apart, using strips of it to bound her hands and her feet. And then she stuffed a sock down the baby's throat, gagging the child as her life slipped away. She left her there with a fractured skull, suffocating as she choked on the sock. It was far too much for her to handle. Santiago would say that after she brutally assaulted her baby, after about a half hour, the child started to turn blue, and it looked like she was already gone. She was no longer moving and no longer breathing. So she placed her body in a plastic garbage bag and put her in the closet for the next 24 hours so she wouldn't have to look at her. The following morning, she and Rivera went job hunting, as if there wasn't a deceased toddler in their bedroom. All of this was said to be because Santiago feared being evicted from where she lived. The landlord at the Spofford Hotel had apparently complained about Victoria's cries because they were disturbing the other residents. The landlord informed Santiago that children weren't allowed at the hotel, and if the child's cries continued, they would be evicted. Rather than leave or find some other way to resolve the matter, taking the child's life was somehow the better option. And the horror didn't end there. When they felt it was time to get rid of her body, they took the garbage bag containing her, wrapped her in a towel, and placed her in a stroller. They would then proceed to walk that stroller with her remains all the way to Dryer Offerman Park, located in the vicinity of where she was found. They had been walking for some time, and it began to get dark. It was now nighttime, and nobody was around. They felt this was the perfect time to get rid of her. They reached an area not too far from a shopping center where Rivera was working at the time. It was desolate, not much going on, especially when the sun was down. They made their way closer to the bay, reaching the end of a pier, and dumped her body and the stroller into the water, thinking that her body would be carried out to sea. They then went about their day like nothing happened. The news was sickening, but authorities were diligent, quickly unraveling Santiago's web of lies. Even though they had a confession from both Rivera and Santiago, they still needed an official confirmation from the medical examiner. On Saturday, December 5th of 1998, just a day after she was found, the autopsy results were in, and they revealed that, as expected, her life ending was a result of blunt impact injuries to the head, as confirmed by Ellen Borakov, a spokeswoman for the medical examiner's office. Once the report was officially in, Santiago was charged with second-degree murder, and Jorge Rivera was charged with tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution since he helped cover up the crime. According to authorities, Rivera had nothing to do with taking the child's life. He wasn't even home when she did it, but he was still fully responsible for helping her dispose of the body. The news of what was done to baby Victoria would quickly spread across the 5 boroughs and the tri-state area, and soon, anyone watching the evening news would learn of the sickening details.
Another tragic story involving violence against a child tonight, this one in Brooklyn. A mother is charged with murder, accused of killing her own daughter. Police say Maria Santiago made up a story that her daughter was snatched from her in a subway station yesterday. Instead, she is accused of killing the 20-month-old and dumping her body in the water.
The medical examiner performed an autopsy this morning, and the cause of death was blunt trauma to the left side of the head, which caused a skull fracture, which resulted in her death.
Santiago's boyfriend, Jorge Rivera, is charged with tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution for allegedly trying to cover up the death.
As she walked out in handcuffs, an agitated Santiago would scream at reporters when asked if she took her child's life, saying that she did no such thing, screaming, "No, leave me alone."
Did you hit your baby in the head, ma'am? Did you hit your baby?
No, just leave me alone.
But the evidence said otherwise. She also admitted to it, There were just too many gaps in her story from the very start, and it wasn't their first time seeing an awful scenario like this play out. It was hard to imagine that a mother could go to such heartless and extreme lengths just to silence her child, someone with no criminal past and no history of child abuse that they were aware of. But it was true. At the end of it all, it was a baby who suffered this painful end, and nothing could bring her back. The best they could do is make sure that she paid for what she had done. But less than 2 weeks later, more disturbing evidence would surface, and it all started to make much more sense. It turns out that before Santiago came to Brooklyn with Victoria, Mauro, the father of the child, reported Santiago to Child Welfare Services in San Antonio. The reports made involved child neglect, since he feared she wasn't being taken care of and saw signs of abuse. He wanted it to stop, but shortly after, Maria left Texas entirely, relocating to Brooklyn, making it nearly impossible to follow up on. The two then lost contact, and he would never see his daughter again. The next time he heard of Victoria, she was already gone. Her life brutally taken at the hands of her own mother, someone he'd already tried to report, and it did no good. By September of 1999, Santiago and Rivera were on trial to answer to their charges. Here, she would make more statements, giving alternate versions of what took place, even though what she did and what baby Victoria suffered through was well documented. She tried shifting the blame from herself over to Rivera, saying that he was home and it was him who took the baby's life. She stated that he, quote, lost his mind and killed the girl, but it was far too late for more stories. Nobody had any reason to believe her. She already said what she did. She detailed how she brutally assaulted her defenseless child, and it all fell in line with the allegations that she faced back in Texas. No mother would even be able to utter those words she spoke when she confessed. It was clear that she was a monster, masquerading as a parent, bounding her daughter, suffocating her with a sock, smacking her relentlessly, and leaving her to bleed out with a broken skull before tossing her in a closet. She was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 22 years in prison for what she did to her daughter. But as of 2020, she's a free woman. Rivera, whose charges weren't the same as Santiago's, was convicted of helping cover up the crime. He's also free, and it's not even clear how many years he did. The unimaginable cruelty that baby Victoria experienced was a shock to all who heard it, and after all the articles, when all was said and done, her name faded from the headlines, almost like it never happened at all. She was an innocent child who didn't even live to see her second birthday, brutally slain for something as harmless as crying. She could have had digestive issues, she could have been teething, maybe she was just tired or hungry, or maybe it was all related to a number of other health issues that can result in a baby crying nonstop. This child never even had the chance to speak, but her cries spoke 1,000 words. The monsters responsible for this disgusting act didn't even bother to find out if there was anything else wrong with her. The woman who birthed her would rather take the child's life than care to understand the cause. She wanted her quiet, and she didn't care how it happened, even if it meant silencing her permanently. And the person that she found herself with decided that instead of reporting this crime, instead of doing the right thing, he would rather help dump her body, getting rid of her like she didn't even matter. Even if she wasn't his child, who does something like this? It's always very strange to me when two wicked individuals like this somehow cross paths, just willing to help each other carry out the most disgusting crime with no hesitation. It's always the innocent who pay the price. Victoria deserved to live a full life, one free of harm, filled with happiness. Not one single photo exists of her, and her name only lives on through a few articles that speak of her horrifying final moments. The chance to live was stolen from her by two sick people who did not deserve a second chance, but they got one, and baby Victoria never will. From San Antonio, Texas to Brooklyn, New York, it seems that she was always at the mercy of the woman who gave birth to her. Not a mother, just a person who made her own daughter's final resting place the shallow waters of Gravesend. If alive today, Victoria would be 27 years old. Rest in peace, Victoria Maria Santiago. You aren't forgotten.